Hi, good evening to all of you. Today, as part of our special class on Unacademy Unlock YouTube platform, we'll be looking at one of the important topics in our syllabus, inclusive growth and planning. This topic is there in our both political governance as well as economy and other papers of general studies also. So, before we start our class, as usual, let us start with the courses offered on an academy platform. As you can see here, these are the top rankers of an academy this year. The second ranker, the 9th, 10th, 13th, and 14th, 16th, and 20th. They're all part of an academy's learners programs. There are 7 top rankers between 1 to 20. Between 21 to 120 rankers, 20 learners, and between 101 to 761, 140 rankers, which is a very good performance. Then, what are the other the courses for students on an academy platform? As you can see it here, those who have taken admission for 1 year and above GS Plus combo subscription, they'll get a 3 months free extension of this subscription. This is available only up to today, that is the last day of November. So hurry and get that subscription, GS and optional combo subscription, and you will get a lot of discounts. Apart from that, when you quote our referral code also PKS10, you will get 10% more additional discount also. So don't forget to quote our referral code PKS10. Then we also have 7 combo. 1 year, if you look at GS and optional, it was only 77,000. Now it is 55,204 rupees, which is a dead cheap compared to what you get in classrooms in Delhi and other places. For 50,000 rupees, 50,000 rupees, you don't even get what you call even optional also. Here you are getting 1 year both GS and optional combination. This offer duration is between 25th to 30th November. Again, today is the last date. So make sure that you can take the classes and you can use our referral code to get 10% additional discount. Then, what are the courses that have been started here on an academy platform? You can see all optionals. 5th November, sociology optional. 8th November, agriculture optional. 23rd, political science. 24th, we have started our optional also, public administration. And on 24th itself, geomorphology also was started. You can take admission. And apart from that, from 1st of December, that is tomorrow onwards, you will have GS batches for both 2022 and 2023, starting simultaneously. You can see here the journey of the learners from 1st of December till the mains, that is 16th of September. That is for next year. Then you can see here for 2023 also, it can see that from 1st of December to 23rd September also for coming years mains also. And you also have free test series for UPSC CSE. This free test series, if you had taken the test, the combat, then you could have got this free test series. Then another advantage that you have is you will get 20 GS books as per latest trends of UPSC. And these books you will get free of cost, provided if you take GS and optional combo with 1 year or above duration. Then you will get the GS either books also. Then you will also be getting iconic subscription benefits. If you are taking iconic subscription, you will be getting a lot of benefits. What are the benefits that you will be getting? You will have personal guidance, study planner, live mentoring, test analysis, expert guidance, live classes, weekly tests, study materials, unlimited access, and structured courses. These are all the things that you will get as part of a personal iconic subscription. So finally, these are all the courses that you find on Unacademy. So let us come back and look at what we are discussing now. Let us come back and look at what we are discussing now. Today's topic of our discussion is inclusive growth and planning. So what we are looking at is why this inclusive growth is important. What is this inclusive growth? What are challenges to inclusive growth? And how planning can help us to ensure inclusive growth, to achieve the objectives of inclusive growth. First and foremost, right, why inclusive growth is important for India? What are the different components of inclusive growth? So let us look at all of them. If you have any doubts, you can ask me. I will answer them also. If you have any doubts, you can ask me and I will answer them also. So starting with why do we need inclusive growth? As all of us know, according to Oxfam report, top 1% of our population own more than 70% of our GDP. In fact, it is 77% of our GDP. We have only 3 states accounting for almost 90% of FDI attracted in the country. And we also have widening inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth, and we also are witnessing what is called jobless growth. We are also witnessing jobless growth. So what is happening here is that as we study in economics, what the country is witnessing is what is called K-shaped growth. What is this K-shaped growth? Whatever the economic growth that is taking place, it is only resulting in rich people becoming richer and poor people poorer. On top of it, we have unfortunate corona disaster. And what happened during this corona disaster? We have seen almost 9 crore people losing their jobs during the corona disaster. On the other hand, suddenly there was huge amount of increase in the revenues of rich people in the country. We have a huge amount of increase. For example, the Reliance Industries Limited has attracted huge amount of foreign investment during this disaster. So is the case with Adanis. So what is happening is that rich people, they are becoming richer and poor people are getting poorer. Can any country sustain this kind of growth? Obviously not. This kind of growth cannot be sustained after some period of time. Why? Because at the end of the day, growth can be sustained only when it is inclusive and equitable in nature. And this is where we talk about the problems here. Right? That is where the country is facing now. As we see here, what are the different dimensions of inclusive growth? What are the different dimensions? Please remember the questions are repeatedly asked because this is a topic, very important topic in our economy. And of course, half of our governance, in fact, entire governance is all about only inclusive growth. So let us look a little bit more into inclusive growth before looking at the dimensions of inclusive growth. What we are witnessing now in our country is, especially after the economic reforms of 1991, the country definitely has witnessed very significant increase in the growth levels. Before 1991, India had what sarcastically called as Hindu rate of growth, wherein the growth rate was growing between 1950s and 1980s. Economy was growing between 3 to 3.5%, maximum 4%. We were never able to realize our potential because of various reasons, because of state-led development, because of the failure of public sector enterprise, because of the license quota permit range. In 1980s, we could come out of that Hindu rate of growth. Average growth rate during the decade of 1980s was 5.5%, which was very good. But that growth rate could not be sustained for various reasons. And by 1991, Indian economy had collapsed. And if you look at it between 1950s and 1990s, two things we can see there. One is growth rate itself was very low. Second, whatever the economic growth rate that had taken place, that was only benefiting very few sections of society. It really did not benefit the poorer and weaker sections of society. In 1950s and 60s, if you look at our growth model, this is where we talk about the planning process also. In 1950s and 60s, if you look at it, the focus was more on ensuring rapid economic growth on the basis of the assumption that this economic growth automatically transforms into overall development. This is based on either this is based on what we call either this is based on what we call trickle down effect theory in economics. You should know all those things. What is this trickle down effect? As the name itself indicates, it says that the benefits of economic growth would trickle down to the lowest sections of society. That means, as and when economic growth takes place, it would automatically result in poor people also benefiting out of the growth. And this trickle down effect itself is based on another economic theory of what we call it as invisible hand of the markets given by Adam Smith. And what Adam Smith has said is that there is an invisible hand in the society, in the economy, in the form of markets, private sector, that would translate the overall economic growth into inclusive development. Everyone would benefit out of this growth. But both this invisible hand as well as the trickle down effect proved to be completely wrong. Why? Because when economic growth has taken place all over the world, not only in India, it only led to rich people becoming more richer at the cost of poor people, because it did not result in any drastic improvement in the standards of poor people. So in 1950s and 60s, Jawaharlal Nehru's planning process focused more on this focused more on ensuring rapid economic growth by investing heavily in public sector enterprises on the basis of the assumption that this would ultimately lead to overall development. But that was not the case. What are the growth that had taken place? It has benefited only very few sections of society, and it has also led to what we call famously the creation of islands of prosperity in an ocean of poverty. Growth was taking place only in those areas wherein public sector enterprise had come up. We had seen what we call the emergence of what we call industrial towns. And beyond that, rest of the country was under poverty and backwardness. That is what we said, creating islands of prosperity in an ocean of poverty. Creating islands of prosperity in an ocean of poverty. It has not resulted. So from 1970s onwards, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had decided that her objective would be to focus more on what she called it as inclusive growth, equitable growth. How to ensure this inclusive and equitable growth? she had decided that this would be done by focusing on redistribution of income and wealth in favor of weaker sections of society. And what is the instrument that she has selected? She would take the money from the rich people in the form of taxes and would give it to the poor people in the form of subsidies. That was the model she had adopted. So she had started hundreds of developmental welfare schemes, which we are even implementing now also. And the tax rates were also very high. Income tax rate was as high as 97% also. Ultimately, the objective was to redistribute. Obviously, this model was a failure. It was an utter failure. In 1980s, we continued with the same kind of populism, that is, give more subsidies to the people, give more relief to the people immediately in the form of subsidies. That is how we thought it is removing poverty. Obviously, that is not the way to remove poverty. That can never be the way to remove poverty also. So, what we have done, what are the limited resources that we have only focused on spending all the limited resources to provide populistic subsidies to the people. And for how long we have to provide those subsidies? We have to provide those subsidies for as long as people are poor. And can the people ever come out of poverty? No. Why? Because they can come out of poverty only when there is growth. This is what we say. When there is economic growth, you can talk about inclusive growth. When there is no growth, there is no question of any inclusive growth also. This is where the problem had come up. And by 1991, due to political populism, due to fiscal profligacy, due to inefficient public sector enterprise, due to proliferation of a very high number of developmental welfare schemes, ultimately what happened was our economy had collapsed by 1991. When our economy had collapsed by 1991, we had no option but to radically transform our economic policies, and we have adopted liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And one of the positive consequences, outcomes of liberalization, privatization, globalization was we could come out of that Hindu rate of growth. And we could also ensure a sustainable growth rate for a long period of time. Between 2004 and 2005 and 2011, the country was growing almost at 9% per annum, which was unheard of. From around 3 to 3.5%, it was growing at 9% per annum, which was very good. But still, the problems remained. That is, even the economic growth was taking place, so were increasing inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth. So were widening inequalities. Rich people were becoming richer and poor people still poor only. So, inclusive and equitable growth, 12th five-year plan, which was not implemented, had spoken about this inclusive and equitable growth. The draft report of a 12th five-year plan had spoken about various dimensions of inclusive growth. The questions which are repeatedly asked in our examination. So let us see what are these dimensions of inclusive growth. When do we say a country has inclusive growth? First and foremost, it has to be job-led growth. That means whatever the economic growth that is taking place, it must be resulting in providing jobs to the people. How can you remove poverty? You can remove poverty not by giving them subsidies. You can remove poverty by providing productive employment to the people. Productive employment to the people. This is what we call job-led growth, right? And if you go by this parameter in India, definitely, before reform process and after reform process, we have not done well on this parameter. And especially after 1991, our employment elasticity of economic growth had come down. What do we mean by this parameter called employment elasticity of growth? That means For every 1% increase in our GDP, what is the corresponding increase in our employment jobs? Unfortunately, in India, our employment velocity of growth is only 0.33%, 0.3% only. That means if your GDP is increasing by 1%, 1 percentage points, your employment is increasing only by 0.3%. When do we call it as job-led growth? If both of them are the same. That is when GDP and employment are growing at the same proportion. Unfortunately, in India we had only what we call job-less growth rather than job-led growth. What could be the reasons why we did not have job-led growth? The reasons are obvious. The reasons are very, very obvious in front of us. Unless we want to close our eyes, the reasons are there in front of us all the time. After 1991, the 9% growth rate that we have achieved was mostly because of rapid growth of service sector. If you look at the present year also, contribution of service sector to our GDP is 57.5%, almost 58%. And this service sector is mostly capital intensive. They don't provide much employment opportunities. Where can we get employment in the country? Agriculture, already we have what we call disguised unemployment. Manufacturing sector is the one which can provide employment to people. But unfortunately, this manufacturing sector, the growth has stagnated or sometimes declined also in India. And this is where the problem with what we call jobless growth. And that is the reason why we could not achieve what is called inclusive growth. And that is the reason why we are witnessing what is called widening inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth. And what is happening is that we are witnessing jobless growth, which is adding more to the vicious cycle of poverty. What is that? We will see a little bit later. Next dimension of inclusive growth is, as we know, even today, also 50% of the people depend on agriculture for their livelihood. Farming community in rural areas all over the country, 50% of our population still depend on agriculture for their livelihood. If you have to ensure what is called inclusive growth, if we have to achieve the objectives of inclusive growth, it is not possible by leaving out this 50% of our population. Then what should be done? We must increase the farmers' income. We must make agriculture remunerative for poorer and weaker sections of society, especially small and marginal farmers. As all of us know, these small and marginal farmers, they constitute almost 90% of our farming community. Unless we can double their income, unless we can make agriculture profitable, remunerative for them, we cannot achieve inclusive growth. That is the reason why this is another important dimension of inclusive growth. Next, proceeding further. Obviously, if you go by 2011 census, more than 68% of our population lives in rural areas. 68% of our population still lives in rural areas. Again, you cannot have what is called inclusive growth. You cannot have inclusive growth when you cannot develop the 68% of population. You must make sure that this 68% of population become part of the growth process. This 68% of population benefits out of the growth process. And this is where rural development becomes extremely important. As we have discussed earlier, whatever the economic growth process that had taken place, it has only resulted in what we call it as islands of prosperity in an ocean of poverty. Vast areas of the country remained poor and backward, with only very few parts of the country getting all the development. Some of these metropolitan cities are developed at the cost of the rest of the country. And that is the reason why we say rural development is an important dimension of inclusive growth. We must provide productive employment to people in rural areas because agriculture is no longer a profitable remunerative activity for them. We must focus on agro processing industries. We must focus on providing skills to the people in rural areas. We must focus on developing entrepreneurship among the people in rural areas. We must focus on having more startups in rural areas. Unfortunately, for the government, startups means only software. Startups means only Bangalore or other metropolitan cities. Where do we have startups in rural areas so that we can unearth the kind of entrepreneurship skills that the people have in rural areas? This is where the entire focus of inclusive growth should be. Then, next important dimension of inclusive growth, as you can see here, is development of small scale and cottage industries. Why? Because these small scale and cottage industries are the ones which are what we call them as labor intensive industries. They employ more amount of people. Take the case of handloom industries, weavers, and textile industries. They are the ones who employ more number of people. Please remember, the bigger the organization, the lesser will be the employment potential. Why? Because organization, in order to cut down its costs, in order to improve its efficiency, will go for computerization and artificial intelligence, AI. So, the bigger the organization, the lesser would be its employment potential. If the government has to ensure inclusive growth, it should focus on small scale and cottage industries. What are the other areas where in our country at this point of time we can think of providing productive employment to the people? We can think of providing productive employment to the people. What are the other areas? What can be called the sunrise industry as far as employment potential is concerned? Definitely tourism sector. Tourism can provide huge amount of potential. It has huge amount of potential for employment because in and around the tourist places, we can have so many small entrepreneurs like hotels, then tourist guides, then people provide other services to the tourists. This is where we have huge amount of potential. If at all the government is serious about inclusive growth, they should focus on this tourism sector. A small city state like Singapore, Singapore is not a country. It is a small city state like Singapore attracts more number of tourists than entire India can ever imagine also. That is where the potential is there. And you can see here in India, what is not there for tourists to not to come to the country. You can expect anything and they will get everything. You have vast beaches, very dense forests, you have Himalayas, you have deserts, you have ancient forts, and of course you have beautiful religious structures. Everything is there. And of course, you also have different types of climate also. But the only thing is that we have not tapped our tourist potential. Neither the central government nor the state governments have really thought about making tourism a very important sector that can provide productive employment to the people. That can provide productive employment to the people. This is where we can ensure this inclusive growth. Next, proceeding further. Next important dimension of this inclusive growth is development of MSMEs, micro, small and medium enterprises. This is very important. Why? Because as I keep on saying, these are the ones who can provide employment to people. What can the government do here? Government can provide liberal financial assistance to them. The government can focus on improving the skills of the people there. Government can remove unnecessary hurdles in their functioning. Government can provide tax incentives to them to export their products. The government can reduce their cost of production by reducing other other charges like electricity and other charges. This is where you can say huge amount of potential. Huge amount of potential is there. Why? Because ultimately these MSMEs are the ones who can create productive employment for people in rural areas in tier 2 and tier 3 cities of our country. That is where you find a huge number of unemployed people also. Development of MSMEs. Next important dimension of this inclusive growth is automatically what we call ecological sustainability. You cannot have inclusive and sustainable growth, equitable growth, unless we focus on ecological equilibrium, environmental sustainability. Why? Because these kind of disasters that continuously take place, both natural and man-made, are the ones who are ultimately responsible, which are ultimately responsible for widening inequalities. I gave you the example of Corona. In the last 18 months or so, because of Corona, what we have witnessed is widening inequalities. In the last 18 months or so, because of Corona, what we have witnessed is the kind of inequalities. More than 9 crore people have lost jobs. Because of the lockdown imposed by the government, man-made disaster, lakhs of people, migrants, had to walk hundreds of kilometers to their hometowns. And this is where we talk about ecological sustainability. We must make sure that it is said that in Delhi only, we are not going anywhere else, it is said that in Delhi only, in the recent past, because of high levels of pollution of Delhi, high levels of pollution of Delhi, Delhi has lost every year 25,000 crores of rupees through tourism. Nobody wants to come to Delhi because if they know that if they are coming to Delhi, they are inhaling a poisonous gas and there will be huge amount of air pollution, huge amount of traffic pollution. And this is where, that is the reason why we say that this sustainable development becomes an integral part of inclusive and equitable growth. And that is what you can see here. Why this ecological sustainability is important. Farmers, as we studied yesterday also, green revolution has been transformed into green revolution, because of which farming also had become a very difficult activity. Because of his farming also had become very difficult activity. Why? Because of the fact that the farmers simply are not in a position to continue with their farming because of high levels of salinity of the soil, loss of fertility. Why? Because again, the questions related to sustainable development. That is the reason why For inclusive and equitable growth, what we require is ecological sustainability, another dimension. Next dimension of this inclusive and equitable growth is social sector development. We call it as social sector development. What is the social sector development? Development of education and health. This is what we say. What is required is our ability, as you can see the next point, to transform our demographic bulge into demographic dividend. India, in most of the global fora, always boasts of the fact that they are in a position to benefit out of demographic dividend. Why? Because India has a very young population. On the other hand, most of the European countries have what we call aging population. They depend on the government for their survival rather than contributing something productive to the society, to the country. Whereas in India, we always say that we have the benefit of a very young working population between the age of 40 and 60 years. But can we say that as a demographic dividend? Obviously not. Because the fact that all of them are, in fact, most of them are unskilled, illiterate population. They simply do not possess the necessary skills to get productive employment in the job market. That is where, if we have to ensure sustainable development, what we must do is focus on education and health sectors. Unfortunately, this is what we say the weakness of our planning process. From the first 5-year plan till the end of the 11th 5-year plan, what is the basic problem is we have never given importance to what is called social sector development. The basic objective of Jawaharlal Nehru and rest of the prime ministers was more on what we call physical infrastructure, but not social infrastructure. We have never created better schools, good hospitals. Even though we have opted for socialism, please remember the difference between the socialism of the European countries and that of India is that in European countries, as part of socialism, they had invested heavily in both education and health. That is the reason why they could see significant of development. Unfortunately, our socialism simply did not focus on either education or health since independence. Between the first 5-year plan and the end of the 7th 5-year plan, that is between 1950s to 1990s, we have completely neglected education and health, both central and state governments. Why? Because of various reasons. Why? Because education and health are considered higher level needs. The governments were more interested in satisfying basic needs of the people, roti, kapada or makan. Education and health come under higher level needs. So that is the reason why there was no development at all of education and health, because of which we have huge amount of population which is unskilled and unproductive. Did the situation change after liberalization? Unfortunately, it did not. Why? Because after liberalization, what happened after liberalization? After 1991, again the governments have neglected both education and health, this time for different reasons. Why? In the name of liberalization, privatization and globalization, in the name of in reducing the role of the state, what we have done, is we have the state has abdicated its responsibility. It has abdicated its responsibility in favor of the private sector and markets. It has abdicated its responsibility in the favor of the private sector and markets. And this is where the problem had come up. Why? Because private sector does not provide these services free of cost. And unfortunately, people simply do not have the kind of money to be spent on education and health. And again, we are getting into what we call this vicious cycle of poverty. Vicious cycle of poverty. This is what exactly happened. After 1991, for again reasons which are completely illogical, the state has completely ignored education and health, because of which we have not been able to transform our demographic bulge into demographic dividend, because of which we could not achieve what is called sustainable development or inclusive growth. Next important facet of inclusive growth is what we call infrastructure development. Because the private sector will invest in industries only when there is infrastructure. Infrastructure in the form of both physical and social infrastructure. Physical infrastructure, what are we talking? Physical infrastructure in the form of roads, communications, electricity, transportation, water, and resources, other resources. Social infrastructure in the form of education, health, and skilled population. Unfortunately, again, we have not focused on infrastructure development. Without infrastructure, there cannot be any inclusive growth. If you look at most of the states in our country, they lack basic infrastructure for industrial development and growth. Why are we not attracting FDI? For the simple reason that we don't have proper infrastructure in our country. If you go into interior parts of our country, especially rural areas, most of the states do not have what we call all-weather roads connecting rural areas to urban centers. As we discussed the other day also, perishable commodities, agriculture. We don't have warehouses. We don't have cold storage houses. We don't have all-weather roads. We don't have proper transportation and communication facilities, without which you cannot expect overall growth and development also. This is where again we are lacking as far as inclusive growth is concerned. Next important dimension of inclusive growth, as we say, is even though it is not mentioned here, another important dimension is this backward sections of society, socially backward sections of society. If you take India, unfortunately, we have so much of heterogeneity, so much of diversity. And what happened is that some sections of society, some classes, some castes are developed at the cost of others. Take the case of scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, other minorities, or women, or other backward castes. They are not able to get the same kind of opportunities for them to develop like other sections of society. So what happens? More often than not, it is your birth that determines whether you are going to be a successful person or not, whether you are going to get better employment or not, whether you are going to get better education or not. Without this, how can we have inclusive growth? Sachar Committee report has rightly pointed out that Muslims are the most backward economically sections of our society. They are more backward than scheduled castes also. because there is no education. Because traditionally the focus is more on religious education, but not on scientific education, not on English education. But that is what is required in this globalization, in this age of globalization. And then women, who constitute 50% of our population, they don't get again what we call equal opportunities. This is what we say in the dimension of inclusive growth, gender development, gender empowerment. They never get equal opportunities in terms of developing themselves, in terms of either in terms of empowering themselves like that of men. You take the case of a country like America. In America, almost more than 90% of women work in America. Whereas you look at India, what is the percentage of women in overall total in workforce? It is only 2%, not more than that. That is where the problem also is there. Why? Because when women who constitute 50% of our population are not participating in the growth and development of the country, where is the question of what we call inclusive growth? Where is the question of what we call inclusive and equitable growth? Why? Because when 50% of the population is not participating in the growth, the way rest of other 50%, automatically you cannot have inclusive and equitable growth. That is the reason why another dimension of inclusive growth is gender development, gender empowerment. And another dimension of this inclusive growth is how can we create more employers than employment? That is what we have to look at. That is what recently our Prime Minister also has said. We have to focus on creating employers than employment. We have to focus on creating what is called the job, not seekers, but job providers. For that, we have to improve their skills. We have to provide opportunities for them to become entrepreneurs. We have to ensure easy financing. We have to recognize their ideas. We have to create an ecosystem that rewards risk taking within the society. This is where we can again talk about inclusive growth. And of course, another sunrise industry where we can talk about more job creation is what we call agro processing industries also. This is where again you can have good amount of employment opportunities for people, and mostly we can say here for unskilled labor also, wherein India has huge amount of population. So these are all what we call different dimensions of inclusive growth. These are all different dimensions of inclusive growth. If we try to recall, job-led growth, rural development, agriculture development, doubling farmers' income, then gender empowerment, development of either scheduled caste, scheduled tribes or other weaker sections. Then we spoke about these then as part of this inclusive growth, we have spoken about reducing the inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth, and then improving infrastructure, and focus on social sector, education and health, trying to transform our demographic dividend into demographic bulge into demographic dividend. So these are all the different dimensions of inclusive growth which we have spoken about. Now, coming to the next aspect here, what are the challenges to inclusive growth? Yes, what are the challenges to inclusive growth? What are the challenges to inclusive growth in India? This is very, again, the challenges are quite apparent. We know, if you are able to see what is happening in front of you, we know that the challenges are obvious. What are they? First and foremost, population explosion. Our population is very, very high, which makes it very, very difficult to ensure inclusive and equitable growth. still, maybe in the next 20 years or 30 years, India will cross China also. Population explosion, right? And with this population explosion, what happens here is that we have so much of diversity, religious, ethnic, regional, linguistic, and racial. These diversities would result in more inequalities also, social inequalities. That is where the problem is. Why? Because when the population increases at such exponential pace, there will be huge amount of demand for control of resources. And people, they realize the fact that in a democracy, what really matters is the numbers. What really matters is the majority. So people will come together in the name of religion, in the name of caste, in the name of region, in the name of language, in the name of ethnicity, in the name of race. It only creates more divisions, creates more identities among the people. That will be a major challenge again as far as inclusive growth is concerned. Very, very important challenge, because you cannot have economic growth without peace and stability. This economic growth can itself be in a danger because of this population explosion, and also because of the problems that come up with the population explosion. This is the reason why we must control. If you happen to see the newspapers recently, India has stabilized its population, which is a good news. We cannot allow our population to grow more than what it is already now. We must stabilize, we must reach zero population growth rate. Very, very important. Next major challenge to inclusive growth is what we call political populism. What is happening with political populism? Every political party believes only in winning elections immediately. How? Give as many subsidies as you want. And what is the reason given by them for all these subsidies? They say that they are giving all these subsidies because people are poor. According to multidimensional poverty index, more than 50% of the population of Bihar is living below poverty line. That is the reason why they are giving subsidies. Can you remove poverty permanently by giving subsidies? Obviously not. You cannot remove poverty by removing subsidies, by giving subsidies. By giving subsidies, what you are doing? You are only postponing their poverty. Poverty will be there. You are giving them what we call temporary relief from poverty by giving those subsidies. You are giving you are only removing you are only providing temporary relief from poverty by giving those subsidies. Then what happens is that this subsidies would result in what is called a vicious cycle of poverty. What is this vicious cycle of poverty that we are talking about? We say that since people are poor, the government is giving them subsidies. Since people are poor, government is giving them subsidies. Since government is giving them subsidies, they are poor. That is what we say. The second part is very important for us. Repeatedly the questions were asked. Since the government is giving subsidies, people are poor. Why? How can you remove poverty of people? You can remove poverty of people only when they have productive employment, when they have income, regular income. When can they have productive employment and regular income? They can have productive employment and regular income only when there is investment by the government in infrastructure, in both the physical and the social infrastructure. When the government invests in both physical and social infrastructure, what happens? Then private sector will come and invest, and the private sector will provide jobs to the people. And since the government is investing in health and education, these people have the skills also, they can get jobs. That is what we say. Now, since the government is spending all its money only on subsidies, is there any investment by the government in infrastructure? Is there any investment by the government in roads, in electricity, in transportation, in warehouses, in cold storage houses, in education and health? Not at all. So when there is no investment by the government in infrastructure, as you can see here, the next point, what happens? Automatically, people will always be poor. And since people are poor, the government will give them subsidies. Since the government is giving them subsidies, they will always be poor. This is what we call being caught in the vicious cycle of poverty. And every political party is only interested in winning elections immediately, short-term objectives. For example, BJP came to power in 2014 by promising 2 crore jobs every year. By 2019, they were supposed to provide 10 crore jobs. Obviously, everyone knows that they did not. In 2019, before the elections itself, the report had come out that unemployment rate in India was the highest in the last 45 years. So they have not provided 2 crore jobs. Then what did BJP do? They simply opted for populism. Since they could not provide jobs, they have opted for reservations. So they said that we are giving reservations, economically weaker sections, 10% reservations in government jobs. This is not the solution to the problems of what we call inclusive growth. But the governments simply do not have any other solutions also, because they don't have money to invest in infrastructure. Even now also take 37 lakh crores of rupees of central budget, out of which only 15% the government says that will be spending only on capital expenditure. Remaining entire amount of money only on revenue expenditure, on subsidies, on interest payments, on salaries, on defense. Where is the question of economic growth? Where is the question of inclusive and equitable growth? This is a major challenge. Next major challenge, as you can see it on your screen, is high levels of inflation. This is where the problem is. What this inflation does is it makes even average people also poor. During this corona times, what the country had witnessed is high levels of what we call retail inflation, core inflation. The prices of vegetables, the prices of there's food items, the price of oil went up like anything. Why? Because the government imposed huge amount of taxes on petrol and diesel. Automatically, the rest of the prices also will go up. And what happens with this high levels of inflation? Automatically, with high levels of inflation, poor people will become much more poorer. Inflation always benefits the producers and has an adverse impact on consumers. Maximum number of people in our country are only consumers. There are very less producers. Then on top of it, these business cycles like recession and depression also will have a huge amount of negative impact on inclusive growth. That is what you can see that in India also. Since 2017 onwards, the country was facing this recession and depression. Initially it was recession, thanks to corona it was also depression. Last year, in the first quarter of last year, what you could see was that the growth rate coming down by 24.5%. Automatically, it is the poor people who are adversely affected. On top of it, these disasters like corona also are adding more to the challenges of inclusive growth, as you can see. Due to corona, due to recession in our economy, due to corona, more than 9 crore people have lost jobs also. Next, another reason why we cannot have inclusive growth is absence of political leadership, visionary political leadership. This is what we say in the absence of visionary political leadership. As I said, unfortunately for India, our politicians are only interested in winning elections immediately. Every political party is only giving more subsidies, populistic subsidies. Since we could not double farmers' income in 5 years, what did the government do? Give farmers some money. That is a PM Kisan, 500 rupees. 500 rupees per month. 6,000 rupees in an year. 6,000 rupees will be given to them in three different installments of 2,000 rupees each to around 9 crore farmers. That is what the government has said. But is it a solution? Can it be the solution? Obviously not. That is what we said are the challenges to inclusive growth. And what the government should be doing, as we have discussed previously, that is what the government will be or should be doing. Right? So this is about inclusive growth. I am sure you have got some kind of conceptual clarity about this inclusive growth. If you have any doubts, you can ask. Otherwise, I think the time is also up. We can stop it here for today. If you have any doubts, you can ask. Right. Then we can stop it here for today and we will meet next month, that is tomorrow onwards, with other topics also on our special classes and YouTube classes. Till then, take care of yourself.